Hi, welcome to another week of Teen Take Home Crafts. This week I'm going to show you how you can use a variety of colors of acrylic paint and some simple tools to give anything a galaxy makeover. Today I will be demonstrating this technique on a pair of canvas sneakers, but you can do this on a face mask, baseball cap, backpack, t-shirt, bandana, whatever you like. The only things you need to provide for yourself this week are whatever you're going to paint on, a cup of water, and some paper towels. I've provided you with a roll of washi tape so that you can tape off anything that you don't want to get paint on. On my sneakers, this meant that I taped over the white soles so I don't get paint on the soles. You don't have to use the tape if you don't want to, but it's there in case you need to block off any areas that you don't want to get paint on. The other little bit of preparation to do, you will see in your bag what looks like a very, very thin piece of cardstock. This is actually a sponge. If you run it under water, it will grow to the size of a normal sponge. Wring it out carefully and leave it to dry for a little while before you use it so it doesn't thin out your paint too much. You also want to unwrap your toothbrush. I've provided you with a lot of colors of paint. You have black, white, dark blue, light purple, and pink. You can use all of these if you want, but you don't have to. The first thing I'm going to do is mix together some of the dark blue and black to make a very dark navy blue. I'm just going to use the lid of my black paint as a mixing surface. I'm going to pour on a little bit of my black paint. And a little bit of my blue paint. And if it doesn't come out the color you want, you can always add more of either color. I'm going to use the end of my toothbrush to mix. Okay, this isn't quite blue enough for me, so I'm going to add a little bit more blue paint. I gave you more paint than you need for all of these colors. You'll probably be able to do this craft several times. Okay, this is a decent shade of navy blue. The sneakers I will be painting are already black, so I don't need to do a base coat of black to make it look like the night sky. But if what you're planning on painting is not black, I would recommend doing a coat of black paint and then letting it dry before you start. Just going to wipe this off in the paper towels. For most of today, we're going to be using our sponge brush. A little bit of using the sponge in between as needed. And then we're just going to use the toothbrush at the end to flick on some white paint to make it look like stars. Move my paint out of the way so you can see the sneaker. Use my sponge to dab up some paint. I'm just going to start with my navy blue paint, dabbing it on in areas. Now my shoes are a very light navy bluish black, so it's not going to show very much. I'm just creating a bit of a base layer. If it doesn't show up enough for you, you can add a little bit of light blue as well. I'm just going to add a tiny little bit of light blue and mix it in and see how that looks. If it's a while before you do this activity and any of your paints have gotten a little bit dry, just add a tiny, tiny little bit of water and mix it in. That will help. Okay, it's a little bit lighter. It's more of a grayish navy blue now. As you're doing this project, the key is to really blend out the edges of wherever you're painting, because we're trying to make this look like a cloudy sky with a lot of colors in it. Depending on what type of material you're painting on, This paint may soak in a lot, and it may take a lot of paint to show up. Or it may not soak in much at all, and you might not need a lot of paint. My shoes will probably soak up a lot of paint. Okay, and you can't see the paint very much. I'm just trying to create a slightly mottled, cloudy look. And then I'm going to start adding in other colors as I go along. Having this base of wet paint, even if you can't see it much, is really, really going to help the other colors blend into it. You want to keep moving while your paint is wet. You can paint over dried paint, but it's not going to blend quite as well as if you use the wet paint. If it's blending too much and you're having trouble seeing the colors, you can let it dry for a few minutes before you move on. After I do this step, I'm going to move on to my dark blue and start fading a little bit of the dark blue into these areas of the bluish gray. I'm not going to clean my brush between the bluish black and the dark blue. I want the colors to mix together a little bit. I'm going to start with just a little bit of paint on my brush because I don't want it to make the color too bright. You'll notice that when I first put it on the shoe, it looks really bright, but the more I blend it in, the more it soaks in a bit and turns into a much cloudier shade of blue. If you have trouble seeing the colors on your material, feel free to wait for it to dry and then add another coat of paint. It'll show up better the second time because you've got that barrier of paint blocking it from soaking into the surface. If you're having trouble blending the edges with your paintbrush, the sponge will be helpful for that. Let me show you what I mean. You can just really kind of wipe away the edges of the paint with your sponge, and that will help create a nice cloudy edge to your paint. Just doing this in a variety of spots all around the shoe. It's going to be a little bit like tie-dye where you're just kind of blending colors until it looks how you want it to look. After you've done a cloudy dark blue across your entire project, you can start mixing in some other colors. I'm going to give my brush a rinse to get off some of the darker paint. And then dry it off in a paper towel. I might not be able to get all of the paint out, but that's okay. I'm going to next blend in some light blue. And again, you don't want to use too much paint. I'm going to kind of blend that in across the edges of where I had the dark blue. If the color is much brighter than you want it to be, feel free to get your brush a tiny little bit damp and just go over it with a slightly damp brush or sponge, and that will help thin out the color a little bit. I'm going to use my sponge a little bit on this one. There you go. It's blended very well into the darker blue. You don't need a lot of paint for this part. got a bunch of light blue all over the shoe. Next, I'm going to rinse my brush a bit and go in with the light purple. Again, I recommend trying out with just a tiny little bit of paint until you know that you like how it looks. Because you can always add more paint, but it's harder to take paint away. If you do end up using much more paint than you end up liking, just paint over it with a bit more of the dark blue or black. Okay, next I'm going to add some pale pink. Later I might go through with a little bit more light blue as well. The pink and purple are very similar, so I'm not going to rinse my brush in between. Okay, this is how my galaxy looks so far. Next, I'm going to do a little bit more light blue in a couple of spots. Okay, the last step I'm going to do with my sponge brush is do a few spots of white cloudy paint. I'm going to rinse my brush very thoroughly first so I don't mix in too many of the other colors. I'm going to start with just a tiny little bit of white paint. I'm going to start at the edges of one of the other light colors, like this blue right here. Okay, at this point you should have a variety of cloudy colors all over your item. If any spots look a little bit too solid, feel free to just kind of go back in over it with a little bit more paint, and then blend the edges again. Right now I'm almost scrubbing the paint off of my shoe. Okay, the last step of your project is going to take a little bit of practice. We're going to be using a paintbrush to flick paint onto the galaxy. So you're going to get a little bit of white paint on your toothbrush, and you're going to kind of run your finger across the toothbrush in a flicking motion to flick tiny little drops of it onto your painting. This will get paint on your hands, so feel free to put on a pair of gloves if you're not comfortable with that. I recommend practicing on a blank surface. I'm going to get a little bit of paint on my paintbrush. I'm going to flick my finger across it. I'm going to be wiping a lot of paint onto my finger while I do this. It may be hard to see, but you'll be able to tell how it's going on your own project at home. Remember to do this on some paper towel or newspaper. Some of the drops I'm getting are bigger than others. If you get any drops that are much bigger than you want, what you can do is use your sponge to spread them out into just more cloudy white areas. If you end up flicking paint onto any surfaces that aren't covered with newspaper or paper towel, just wipe them off with a damp cloth immediately before they can dry. Okay, I'm ready to test it out on my shoe. We'll see how it goes. This is a new technique for me too. So I'm putting some paint onto my paintbrush and wiping a little bit off on the edge of my container. And there you go, I just got a little bit on my shoe before I even wanted to. So I'm just going to set my paintbrush aside and go in with my sponge and just wipe it out into another white cloud. There you go. Okay, here we go. I'm holding my paintbrush a few inches away from my shoe. I'm using a very quick flicking motion with my finger. I'm getting some streaks of paint on my shoe, but that's okay. Okay, I've got stars all over my shoe. Again, some of them look a lot more like streaks, but it still looks pretty cool. If you really don't like how the streaks look, again, go back in with your sponge while it's still wet and just make those more clouds, add more colors over it, whatever you need to do to get it how you like it, and then try again. This technique takes a little bit of practice. I'm pretty happy with that though. I'm going to leave it carefully to dry without touching, because all of these little streaks of paint are wet, and if I touch them, they're going to smear across. I want them to dry exactly how they are, so I'm going to leave it like this. Next, I'm going to go back off camera and finish the other shoe, and then I will have a finished pair of Galaxy painted sneakers. I hope you enjoy this craft. I would love it if you would share pictures of your finished projects with me. I'm going to put the email address you can send them to in the description. Thank you.